Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. Elvia Wilk's 2019 debut novel, Oval, takes place mostly in an experimental eco-house on the top of an artificial mountain in a near-future Berlin. The protagonists, Anya and Louis, are young, creative types. Anya is a scientist growing roofs for these mountain homes, and Louis is an artist. But in this world, artists are employed by corporations to act as consultants who engage in a sort of proto-institutional critique. It's a fascinating novel that, to me, read like a type of design fiction or speculative design. It builds this entirely spatial environment and then imagines the institutions, the processes, and the systems within it. It's no surprise then that Elvia has a background in architecture writing and a keen understanding of space. She studied sculpture when she was in school and got her start as an art writer. In 2012, she co-founded the digital architecture and design publication Uncube magazine and has written about architecture, critical design, and speculative design for publications like Frieze, Artforum, e-flux, and Rhizome. She has a new book of essays out called Death by Landscape that also explores speculative design alongside essays about the blurry lines between the natural and the artificial, the design of live-action role-playing, and literary criticism on the new weird. I couldn't help reading this new collection, too, as a type of design criticism. So I invited Elvia on the show to talk about how her background in writing about architecture and design influences this work. And the result is an incredibly wide-ranging and scintillating conversation on everything from how her novel grew out of her frustrations with art criticism to how fiction can be a type of critical practice to how she thinks about her own writing process as a type of design. We also get into some of the ideas that animate her work and her thinking, from the blurry lines around artificiality, the politics of speculative design, and the tension in creative acts, whether that be art making or writing or design, between complicity and critique. Often when we talk about design writing, we view that narrowly, thinking about design criticism or reviews or journalism or things that take place in academic journals. And while Elvia isn't a design writer necessarily, her work is expansive and exciting and a model for other modes of writing through which we can understand design. It was fascinating for me to talk to her about this work through this lens. A transcript of this episode, as with all of our episodes, is available for Patreon supporters. Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners who support the show each month on our Patreon. Supporters get bonus interviews, an exclusive monthly newsletter, early episodes, and all sorts of other bonus content. Students can support the show for just $3 a month, and we offer additional tiers for $5 and $10 a month for additional content and early episodes. You can go to patreon.com/Surface Podcast to sign up and get immediate access to all of this content. Thanks for listening, and here is my conversation with Elvia Wilk. I've spent the last couple of weeks just completely immersed in your work, and you are somebody whose sort of subject matter and interests are very wide-ranging. You have written both criticism and sort of reviews and personal essays. I mean, even in the new book, there's a range of formats and writing styles. You've written a novel, you have poetry on your website. I'm always interested in people who sort of have this range of interests and modes that they are working in. Is there something that you feel unites all of those? Do you have some sort of critical project that you are sort of working through all of these mediums, or how do you think about that?
I don't have an algorithm. I'll start saying that. And I do find that sometimes it's hard to summarize or to suggest a through line because I follow what I'm fascinated by and interested in. And that's, of course, contextual and circumstantial. I do think that, especially over the last few years, there's been kind of a coalescence of ideas dealing with what is at the border of the explicable, what experiences can't be accounted for in normal modes of transmission, I use the word mysticism sometimes,
Hmm.
use the word weird a lot. Um,
Hmm.
and I think it's been also pretty consistent over the last few years that I'm kind of obsessed with narratives and fiction in the most expanded sense. But as you say, there's a lot. Before that, I was an art critic for many years. And dealing a lot with artists who engage emerging technologies, artists who deal with collaborating with the non-human world. Before that, I worked for an architecture publication, so I have kind of a background in the built environment. But I think that these curiosities coalesce in ways that I often don't anticipate, and I only recognize them later.
Right, right. I mean, of course, and that's like always how it is. I mean, you said a couple. I mean, I'm gonna do this thing that I hate doing, where I'm gonna just kind of tell you a little bit about some of the themes I've seen in in your work. But you mentioned the weird, which I think comes up again and again. This idea of the weird. These borders is something that I noticed also, and the way I was thinking about it is that these borders between sort of like the real and the unreal, or the artificial and the natural, and the blurring of that, um is something that I find really interesting in your work. And then there's this other sort of thing that I'm interested in talking to you about complicity and critique, that you talk and write about a lot.
Yeah.
And the reason I say those three is because those three are things that I also think about a lot in the world of design. And I read your novel when it came out, and I knew you primarily as somebody who kind of wrote about architecture and design. And so I was wondering about the sort of architecture side of this. It, how does that sort of fit in, or is that some sort of container for all of these subjects? Also, the other one being the sort of narrative and form, I think, is something that's somewhat architectural and spatial in some ways.
Yeah, totally. I'm glad you said complicity versus critique. I'm glad you you picked up on it and said it back to me. I do think the politics of art making, the politics of spatial design, and the politics of narrative are continually,
Yeah.
um, questions for me and things that I'm really invested in and coming at from different angles. But I can speak specifically to some of the spatial aspects of the novel, which came out in 2019. It's called Oval, and the one of the like kickoff inspirations for the story was the speculative architecture proposal from earlier in the 2010s by this small kind of independent young architecture group called Mila. And they proposed this kind of wild speculative mountain
Right. Right.
as solution, quote unquote, for what to do with Berlin's Tempelhof airfield, which is basically, I think, still Europe's largest undeveloped public space. So
Mm.
it used to be, it's known as the Nazi airport. It was an airport until I think like 2001. And since then, it's the whole airfield has just been completely left to people's devices, been used for things like it's a public park. The runway is for like skating and biking and all sorts of weird wind sports. There's a community garden. There's sometimes pop-up art things and some bars and restaurants. Anyway, so it's been a really contentious issue in Berlin for many years. What should we do with the space? Obviously, the real estate lobby wants to put a bunch of condos and shopping centers on, but every time a vote comes up, the Berlin population says, "Don't touch it." Um, and I find that incredibly heartening and inspiring, right? How wonderful to not build as the solution to what to build. That's so
Right.
rare. We don't see that in a hyper developed urban space. Um, so this joking yet serious, they're very insistent that this was a real proposal. The architects to build just an enormous mountain on this airfield was a riff on this idea of undevelopment. So like, what if we undeveloped it further and we made it just quote unquote completely natural? And they took this proposal pretty far. They did consulting with like geologists to try and figure out how they would build the mountain. They talked to meteorologists about what it would do to the weather conditions in the city. And then they did this huge ad campaign to try and suggest into public, instill the idea in public consciousness that this was really going to
Right.
happen.
Right.
Anyway, this was fascinating to me. I became obsessed with it. I love this idea of a natural artificial installation in an urban space. I love this idea of Berlin as a wide open speculative zone. I lived there for 7 years, so this is very much a Berlin book. And as you say, I was working as kind of an architecture design art writer at the time. And I was, as many people in, like, I guess that was the 2010s, just really stuck on, what is speculative design? Like,
Right.
is it architecture? Is it writing? Is it art? Does it matter? And of course, there was a real economic downturn in Europe at the time. So you had all
Hmm.
of these trained architects who couldn't really lend their skills to mega projects. So what could they do? They could imagine things. And I found that really generative from a narrative and literary perspective.
Well, I have so many questions just based on kind of that answer that you gave. First, for people who haven't read it, can you sort of give the high level how do you describe this book to people? You've already hinted at this mountain, this sort of fictional mountain that is in many ways a character in the book. But what is this kind of story that you start to build around this?
Well, so the cover copy or whatever, I guess, says something. It's really hard to say what your book is about, but I spent a lot
Yeah.
of time trying to do it. So you catch me at a good time 3 years later when I can.
I figured that. Yeah.
So the book is about a couple who lives on like kind of in an eco village on the side of this mountain, which is kind of inspired by, but not exactly
Mhm,
the same
mhm.
as this real fake proposal mountain. It's in kind of an alternate reality. I call it a reality adjacent version of
Right, right.
Berlin. And they have kind of a cast of friends who are creative professionals. The city is becoming increasingly taken over by corporations who are buying up the real estate and the public land. The main character is a scientist who works in biotech, and her partner is an artist. But in this universe, all artists have become corporate consultants.
I
And
love that. Yeah.
again, it's reality adjacent. We're not too far away from
Right.
that.
I was listening to an interview that you gave shortly after the book came out, and you said that a lot of the sort of early writing for the book grew out of your frustrations with the limits of art writing and sort of writing these reviews and word counts and sort of the predefined structures. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more and sort of how fiction became a way for you to kind of work through those things you were thinking about in the art writing in a new way and to kind of break out of those frustrations.
Yeah, it's important to say that writing reviews basically was how I learned to be a writer. So I would
Mm.
never say that that was, that's not a really formative and
Right,
wonderful
right.
experience. It's also grueling and not very well compensated. um, but writing a ton fast in a certain way for publication is just really important. It teaches you how to use your muscles and to just
Right,
kind of
right.
experimenting within form is also the only way to figure out how to push against form, I think.
Hmm.
Or maybe that's not true. For me, it was the case. And I should say that I studied visual art and I used to make sculptures in college. So I was thinking spatially myself in a lot of ways. And I
Mm.
always like the way that the narrative in Oval is constructed, I think of as a very spatial narrative and very
Yeah.
visual. Like there's a lot of like the city is as you say, the mountain is kind of a character, and I was really interested in creating spatial experiences through the reading experience. I'll put it that way.
Hmm.
And the yes, it is just the case that after some years reviewing shows and writing about design conferences and writing about buildings, I was just like, man, I
Yeah.
also want to speculate. Like there's, like it's really fun
Ah.
to speculate. And I also thought, like, what if I wrote something that was like megalomaniac? Like I have maybe a little bit of a megalomaniac streak. Not, too scary, but like there is something about taking on like not just bite-sized projects that appeals to me. And I thought, what
Mm.
if I write something that takes years? What if I write something where I can fit a ton of research and a ton of pieces into and the great thing about writing a book length project is that everything starts to become it. And like everything you're reading is suddenly relevant, and it is this kind of like crazy red yarn tacked up over the walls kind of like pattern making state that you enter, I think, where it's a really fascinating headspace. And I really just also wanted to learn a new skill. Like, it turns out that writing a plot is like a skill you can learn.
Yeah, yeah. I have questions about that. I love that you said that, actually, because in the book of essays, in the last essay, A Book Exploded, which is sort of about the writing of Oval, you talk about also how the characters really came first and were sort of born out of your own experiences. And I was really interested in those two sides, the sort of the plot of your life and what you were trying to work through with these characters that you were inventing, with these ideas of art and criticism and, kind of writing, how those start to come together, and how you could kind of use fiction as a form of critique while also advancing narrative. You know what I mean?
No, it's really hard. I didn't know how to do it, and I still don't really know. But one of the crazy things about writing something like in a totally new form is that you think you're discovering all of these problems that nobody has ever solved before, but it turns out there's hundreds of years of people finding solutions to these problems.
Yeah.
So then once you start reading in search of formal solutions, it's a totally different kind of reading, which I also think is really interesting. So you kind of read for like specific technique, and
Right.
that's a really interesting way of engaging with texts, I think. But maybe that's beside the point. Yeah, the question of developing characters and developing a world was not just central to the writing process, but also to what I wanted the book to be about, which is about the intersection between like large systems and individual lives.
Mm,
What things are beyond individual control, what things seem like they're in our control but are not, how
right.
relationships and intimate love and friendship can't help but be affected by, say, violent economic systems and ecological change. And so
Mhm.
this like I talk about it kind of as like the mediation between the big and the small, or the long and the short, or something like that, where I was trying to find out how these things could reciprocally influence each other.
Sometimes when I hear fiction writers talk, they talk about I'm somebody who has never written fiction, who reads a ton of fiction, who has tried to write fiction, and just, I do not have that muscle yet, and find it very hard. But I hear people talk about sort of novels of plot versus novels of ideas a lot of ways, and I feel like I think, most novels are a mix of both. But you really kind of bring those together. And so I'm wondering, do you see Oval as a work of criticism? Were you able to kind of work out those things that you were wrestling with in the art writing? Were you able to do that or engage with those through shifting from writing reviews or writing about shows to creating something wholly your own?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I think about it as a work of criticism or critique, but I do know that it helped me go directly into the thicket and the tangle and the knot
Mm,
of those problems really, really directly, in a way that I wasn't able to unless I kind of invented this fantasy world,
right.
where
Because
all
of like a distance, you think?
I think it's because there's you get to do so much world building and so much many components are in play.
Mm,
Like when writing about an art review, you rarely get to write about, the life of the artist, the life of the viewer, the weather outside, like the materials that were used, the size of the thing in relation to your
mhm,
body, how you
mhm.
had a headache that day. Like
Right.
it's not so holistic.
Right.
And creating this like comprehensive world, at least inside your mind, I think, and allows this kind of just like collision of scales and collision of different kinds of understandings of the problem, which is, the problem that of contemporary life is more
Right.
complicated and maximal than any one person could get into. But it is useful to be able to think along the lines of yeah, of all of these different aspects of life at once. And yeah, as far as like, is it plot or ideas, I think my main and only goal when I set out to write a story was to tell a good story.
Mm,
And I didn't want to cop out and do what I do think that a lot of like kind of people experimenting with form end up kind of
Right.
not trying to write a good story because that's beside the point. But I was
Right.
like, I want this to be a fun read.
Now, having written that book, thought through that, did that work, are there things from the process of world building, from thinking about narrative and plot, from character development, that you see has influenced the nonfiction work, the longer form essays, when you still are doing sort of like book reviews or things like that? What did you learn from that experience of that world building that you're still kind of working through now in other projects?
I don't know if this is a direct answer, but what comes to mind immediately is that I learned about scenes.
Mm.
Um, and maybe that's not like a useful answer for somebody who's not also writing fiction or something. But to learn how to tell a story in a scene is a very different skill than to, say, describe something from an abstract perspective or place it in, historical context or
Mm.
something like that. But to actually tell the story of encountering a work of art, for instance, I found to be something that I understood or wanted to do more better after having written, novels are basically a bunch of scenes.
I mean, it's actually interesting because many of the essays in the new book are a series of vignettes of scenes that you're piecing together to kind of tell a story or to make an argument, and that seems very novelistic to me now that you say that. Some of the formats of the essays in the new book.
I think so too. And I realized kind of late in the game, actually, while revising that book, that several of the, I guess, like the things I had been trying to convey, rather than talking about them, I could kind of show them through interactions or through scenes.
Mm.
And that was kind of like a late shift in the mode of storytelling that I did, which I've definitely carried with me since then.
I I think a lot about sort of the limits of criticism and the limits of writing about, I'm in my world, design, but for the sake of this conversation, we could talk about culture or material culture even,
Mhm.
and how maybe this goes back to those frustrations that you were having 5-6 years ago. The sort of the tools of analyzing, of describing, of narrativizing these things, um, just the limits of that and the sort of what that those forms can do, and then what fiction can do. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on, maybe this connects to the previous question, sort of fiction as a form of critique,
Mhm.
or in how through world building you can kind of analyze the questions of our day, or the objects that we're surrounded by, or the questions that you're kind of working through in the more critical work.
Yeah, I think that that's something I'm exploring in the book of essays pretty directly a lot of the
Hmm.
time. And I still have a hard time answering that. What is the role of fiction? I hope I never have an answer to that because I hope it's always exciting and always changing and always updating according to the political moment. And
Yeah.
that is something I also talk about in the book is like, well, maybe the role of fiction is different in the climate era and in the era of hyperspeed capitalist commodification of ideas than it was 100 years ago. And maybe it is okay to rethink the role of narrative and fiction and art in general in relation to politics, given the kind of extinction mode that we're living in. But yeah, I guess thinking about what fiction maybe can uniquely do, or for me, I guess one thing that I say at some point in that essay, A Book Explodes, was that I felt like I gained companionship and company through the process of writing.
Right. Right.
First of all, these characters who accompanied me, and then the readers who accompany you in a story in a way that I really think reading fiction is a different process than reading criticism. And so there's a
Hmm.
different kind of engagement and a different kind of companionship you gain through that writer reader relationship.
I want to go back to sort of something that you said earlier about studying art, making sculptures, thinking spatially. You've written extensively about architecture. You're founding editor of Uncube. I'm wondering how that sort of spatial thinking and the move from sort of again, I'm reducing I'm reducing the narrative here for the sake of question. The move from kind of writing and actually working spatially to writing, how that background sort of influences the writing work.
Yeah, I don't have. I worry that I can't satisfy this question because these things are mysterious. But
Right.
certainly, like as I mentioned, like with the novel, that was entirely an urbanism project to me. Especially at the start, I
Hmm.
was like, "What is happening in Berlin? Like, how is this city evolving? What the hell is going on with
Yeah. Yeah.
privatization? What the hell is going on with artists and their levels of engagement with the kind of like absorption of wealth into a certain class, et cetera, et cetera. And those questions have never left me. So I guess really these questions of how I guess this is also something that has come up quite a bit since then in my like more kind of like magazine writing, stuff about like internationalism and stuff about
Mm.
how cities govern themselves and how localism works.
Hmm.
Really, like during the pandemic, I thought an incredible amount about local space, local
Right.
activism,
Right.
what really a building is, what a block is, what an apartment is. I'm not alone. We were all thinking about that. But this helped me loop back to some earlier questions I had about interiority and exteriority, because I really
Right.
should not talk about my like undergraduate sculptures, but they were all about hiding. They were all about intimacy. They were all about being alone in intimate spaces and this
Uh,
kind of like perforations or entry points into private spaces.
I will move on because I know what it is like to be suddenly find yourself talking about undergraduate visual work that you don't want to talk about. Um, but I mean, what strikes me about so much of your writing, and it's really why I wanted to have this conversation, is just the the kind of design metaphors that you are constantly using. I mean, even kind of way you're talking about form, about space, talking about the way people relate to systems, the chair and the apartment and the block and the city. These are all sort of design questions also, and obviously I'm saying that coming from the design world. I'm interested for you, how do you think about that word design when you hear that? Is that something that feels relevant to your work and your interests?
Absolutely. Not just because of my super long-standing interest in speculative design, and that's something that comes up in the new book of essays like quite
Yeah.
explicitly. Design of say VR experiences,
Hmm.
design of live action role plays, design of games, design of like self-regulating artist
Right.
communities, also really like designers who are making speculative products and how those get co-opted and used for different aims. And yeah, we can talk more specifically about that, but I would also say that writing an essay is something I think of as an extremely designed process.
Mm-hmm.
Like, of course, novels too, but essays to me are like almost spatial problems. Like the way that it works is to generate the ideas and then to rearrange them. And I know that not everyone
Yeah.
writes like that, but I really write in terms of like I wouldn't necessarily call it modular, but it's like discrete parts that will eventually fit together into a proper structure with surface tension.
Right.
And that is, I couldn't phrase it better than a design problem, really.
That's so interesting to hear you say that, because that's how I think of writing as an act of design also. And I just kind of always assumed that was like, oh, because I'm trained as a designer, and so obviously I'm going to think about these adjacent things through design. But I think of crafting an essay like laying out a page or laying out a book, where it's like, okay, what is the hierarchy here, what is the flow, how do these things sit next to each other? I think like very rhythmically and
Mhm.
spatially, modularly, to use your word. I When I teach writing to design students, I say, design and writing are the same thing. They're both essentially works of collage. You're taking these pre-existing pieces that were created by other people, words, punctuation, turns of phrase. In writing or in design, it's images, typography, color, and you're trying to put them together into kind of new permutations to say something new.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I do find it to be different than writing fiction, and I'm going back to writing long form fiction right now, and I
Mm,
just really struck by how different the process of assembly is. It's not, it's not totally divorced in that I'm writing things that could be rearranged and that are often kind of moved and stuff, but the essay, I love it as a form.
yeah.
I love it as a specific, special kind of problem with endless permutations, and I think in terms of sections, I think almost all the essays have a different approach to section making and section breaks, which is not
Mm.
something I get the chance to talk about very often. So I'll just
Go for it. This is the show for that conversation.
I think so. I mean, I remember I used to work for an architecture curator when I was really young. And so we did some exhibition design and we did interviews, made a book, and it was also publication design. So I thought
Mm,
about exhibition making and publication making as similar processes. And he taught me how to structure information in a really
mm.
in a way that I think is based on spatial design and architectural thinking, and I always think about that when I'm structuring an essay, what it means to lead someone through space and not just through time.
Could you talk just a little bit more about that and kind of how, what that actually looks like in the process? Is that something that as you're writing, you are thinking about how these things go together? Or are you sort of writing more fragmentary and then putting them together?
I think I have a process.
Yeah, and I don't mean to like make this a process conversation, but I'm kind of curious now hearing you say that, sort of where that comes in the process.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's funny to reflect on these things because I rarely step back and think about, it's like I wouldn't
Yeah,
want because it suggests that I know how to do it and I don't. So I'm not
right.
gonna
I get it. I get it. Yeah.
I'm not gonna pose myself as some kind of authority figure here, but I will say that collecting material is like I think about it as think about it as collecting a bunch of sticks
Mm.
from the ground, which is I read a ton of books, I collect a ton of quotes, and I make an incredible amount of notes. And then this is how I think about it. I start rubbing the sticks together.
I see. Yeah.
And I see which ones kind of spark, and then I move them around and I rub different ones together. So the biggest part of the process is actually the gathering of the raw material, and that's a really long process. And then the kind of once you have the stuff, you're kind of like then you kind of get to play with it, and so you
Hmm.
sort of get to build. I don't want to extend this metaphor too long, but you get to make a fire, you get to build a little structure, and but it's like you have to have all the sticks first. And I think what's interesting about fiction writing is that you often don't have a lot of sticks. You just have your brain. And that's like, it's not as if I don't do a ton of research, but I'm not like, I don't have like the notes pulled up next to the document. You know what I mean?
Right. And I imagine you are also collecting sticks and you don't know what fire they're going to use to ignite. You're just like, this stick looks like an interesting stick that might be useful, right?
Totally. So
And
then
then
you,
that gets filed away.
yes, an incredibly arcane system of documents as well.
I want to ask you something that I'm not sure you have an opinion on, to be honest, or if you've ever even thought about, but this conversation is making me think about it. I often reflect on sort of how much of design is fiction. um there's both the sort of, in architecture, there's the rendering and the sort of the kind of like projection of this is what it will look like, in addition to sort of speculative architecture and that whole history. In graphic design, there's the mock-up that will show you what the thing might look like. There's this sort of trend in design right now where you put your websites on like fake computer screens or fake phone screens, with like the hand, where you like simulate like wheat pasted posters to show like what the brand will look like on the street.
Yeah.
And all of this is a type of fiction making, but even kind of the act of branding is a type of fiction. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that and on the sort of the way it seems like it just speaks to these interests that you have about these kind of blurry boundaries between the natural and the artificial, the real and the sublime. How the way we kind of consume information and the design of these systems are in many ways fictionalized also. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I have thought about this. It's a great
Oh,
question.
great.
The first thing that I'll say, just as kind of an aside, is that I often like to remind myself that almost every building ever designed will never be built. Like
Right.
every single building, except for a very, very select few, is imaginative and will stay in the imagination forever, or will stay as a design, or in SketchUp or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and that is part of the process of making things real, is making things that are never that are just permanently unreal. And that's actually a pretty like good reminder for how creative processes work, and it also is a
Mm-hmm.
good reminder of how just like commercial systems and industries decide what gets made, not people.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think about that a lot, but I also think about, I mean, something I talk about in Death by Landscape is this fact that in finance capitalism, um, trend forecasting becomes real news, and speculative
Right.
finance becomes real finance. So we can talk about these loops between fiction and reality, not just in an abstract sense, but in a very concrete sense. We can say, there was a story told about what might happen to the economy, and that story meant that that thing happened to the economy, right? Um, and that's true, and that's fascinating when you then think of yourself as writing fictions. Like it's not this one-to-one thing. It's not like I wrote this story about a mountain and now that mountain's going to be built, but something about the story might happen.
Right.
And what responsibility do I have if I account for that fact that hyperstition is real?
I mean, this is maybe a good way to. I want to give you some space to talk about complicity and critique, which comes up in your work again and again. I think what you were saying about, sort of the corporations and the systems making the decisions, not the individual people, and that's sort of a thread of Oval. And as you mentioned, in this world, artists have all become consultants for corporations, which I thought was just such a brilliant conceit. I just loved that whole storyline. The complicity and critique comes up in Death by Landscape a couple times, and this is something that I think about all the time in the design world, and specifically in design education, because we sort of implicitly and explicitly, blanket statement here, kind of talk about the world changing magic of design, that design is creating these new futures, and design can kind of solve these problems. I'm speaking very broadly here, and purposefully exaggerated. And that sort of gets into designers' heads, yet so much of what design does is just working to maintain the status quo. It is just
Yeah.
kind of complicit to the systems. And I'm saying this as a designer who used to work in Silicon Valley, and so I've like been on both sides of that. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about your interest in this complicity and critique, and how you kind of think about that, and the sort of the tension there in creative practice.
Yeah, it's tough. There's a lot of, I think, magical thinking about purity states, like that
Mm,
there could be an outside to a system, or that we could operate completely independently of, we're talking about capitalism, really. We're talking about political structures, really. We're talking about the profit motive, I think, really. It's definitely important and really interesting to me that in design, this really is a different discussion than in art, right? Like
yeah,
designers are making things that get used. Artists are not making things that get used. They are generating profit and they are generating commodities. And so they are, if they're having any level of sales success, they are basically contributing to the banking system. Um,
right.
and so we could talk about museums as banks, basically.
Yeah, right, right,
We can, and gallerists are literally dealers. But that's different than designing things whose telos is to be to enter the commodity system and be used and to transform daily life. I mean, that's a really different.
right.
It's a different epistemological, like it's a distinction that goes very, very, very far back in
Yeah, yeah,
Western history and philosophy. So I'm really interested in how those distinctions fall apart a lot of the time, increasingly, just because, first of all, of people working across fields, which is wonderful, but also because of the way that I guess use value is changing due to the way that commodities are changing. But maybe that's I don't know, in a different direction.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, it's interesting because when I would teach design students in New York, and I would ask them like, why do you want to study design? An answer that I would hear often is, I liked art as a kid, and this is like seems a little more stable
Totally.
than art. And we would just like look across, I taught at Parsons, and we'd just be like, well, right down there is a bunch of galleries. They're making money also. Like, these separations are a lot blurrier than we actually think. And we've decided that one thing is functional and one thing is not, but they're still part of the same system.
Exactly. Yes, that's what I'm trying to say, and that's very well put. And yeah, I also think it's funny that people are like, "Well, I want to apply my creative skills in a practical way," and it's like, well, also, like, what does creativity mean to people? I'm not really sure because, as you've probably experienced in Silicon Valley, the language of disruption and
Hmm.
innovation is the new language of creativity for much of the world.
Hmm.
And that's creativity in service of a very specific type of world building and a specific type of profit. You know what I mean?
Right. And I think that sort of connects to this tension where complicity is masquerading as critique. There's
Yeah.
using words like disruption or innovation is a way to show or perform kind of critiquing the system or thinking of new ways, when in reality often it is just sort of complicit in the systems maintaining the status quo, which I also think is interesting, where they start to kind of perform as one or the other
Yeah.
to cover in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as a student of institutional critique, I think I've come down very hard on the perspective that any institution with any level of power can recuperate any kind of critique, but not just recuperate it, they completely rely on it. Um,
Mm,
the way to self perpetuate power in an institutional sense is to invite critique and then absorb it. It's completely necessary to the functioning of the system to suggest that there could be opposition and there could be antagonism, and then to flatten that out. Like when we look at museums, it's very clear. For instance, you might have an exhibition on abolition at MoMA, and at the same time, MoMA's board members might be
right,
making a lot
right,
of money investing in prisons.
right,
So the performance of critique of incarceration is part of the washing of the museum's real financial activities. So that's one way that this happens. But I think it's also that, for instance, like I did a lot of work researching the way that artists in residence work at
yeah.
companies, specifically at tech companies, because that's sort of where some of these ideas about artists and consultants in Oval came out. And I wrote this essay some years ago about the idea of the artist and consultants, where I traced the history of management consulting and the idea
Mm,
that
hmm.
the management consultant comes in and tells the company, you're doing these things wrong, you need to fix X, Y, and Z. But the position of the consultant has actually been completely invented and is,
Right, right,
kind of this Taylorist idea of maximizing efficiency. But the company doesn't have to change anything as long as they've hired the consultant to slap them on the wrist and tell them they did a bad job. Like hiring the consultant is part and parcel of fixing
right,
the company, and the consultant perpetuates their necessity by always having something else to critique that's never really fixed, or it's fixed in a way that doesn't really cost the company anything. So I talk about that as like sort of the evolution of how artists in residence are often placed within companies. Like, most major tech companies and a lot of industrial institutions have artists who work for them, like from Google to NASA. And those artists are meant to critique. Like their job is to come in and be like, you're really exploiting the workers, or like you're really like ruining attention spans of young people. And and the institution's like, awesome, thank you for telling us that. Now we don't really have to do much about it because we're aware of what we're doing.
right. I mean, I think I'm gonna get on my soapbox for a second, so I apologize. I think that's what's kind of so frustrating to me in the design world, is that that's where graphic design, especially my world, is the most complicit, because it's like, well, we'll come in, we'll rebrand for you, and so then you have a new look, you have a new ad campaign, you have a new slogan, maybe you have a new fancy name. That's the we've changed, where we've evolved, that's the complicity again. It just makes me wonder, what does critique look like in the design set? Design is the consultant in that metaphor.
Yeah.
What does design critique in that setting look like? And it's so hard for me to kind of imagine that, because I become dystopic.
You're not alone. It's hard not to become dystopic there. I think there are avenues, but one recourse that I have, and I like to remind myself of this every day, is that like we're not our jobs, and that we can have many lives, and we can do
Right.
many things, and that we are all complicit to a degree, and that there are things that we can do with that complicity and within that space. But there's also just completely other stuff we can do. Like it's okay to make money one way and have a different, antagonistic relationship to a
Mm.
system in a different way.
Right. That was a good turn to. I was really worried we were going to end this on a down note.
No,
um,
let's pick it up.
I have two more questions to wrap up. I'm curious, kind of what's next for you. You have this essay collection that came out. You just said you were writing some long-term fiction again. I mean, without giving too much away, what else are you working on? And also, just what other things are you thinking about right now?
Well, what I'm working on right now is a new novel, and
Right.
I don't know what it's about yet, but it's about insomnia and it's about lockdown. So again,
Mm.
it's very spatial. It's about claustrophobia, and it's about sort of, I guess I would say, like the extremely complicated division between sleeping and waking in the time that we live in. It's just, I don't really understand what those binary states mean anymore. And so I'm doing some super interesting research into insomnia in Victorian times, where it
Mm.
became a supposed epidemic due to what they imagined was a new hyperspeed technology keeping everyone awake all night. Um,
Mhm.
and
Wow.
yeah, I'm thinking about conditions of sleeplessness.
I know I said I had two more questions. Can I ask you another question about that?
Yeah.
When you said when you were working on Oval that some of that was to kind of see what it was like to write something at book length that took years, to think about plot and character development, to kind of do these things you hadn't done before. Are there things you haven't done before that you're trying to do in this book, or are there sort of other modes that you're interested in, that these ideas were the best way to kind of enact those?
Yes, I am trying something new process wise, which is to write in one document and start to finish. I've
Ah,
never done that
wow.
before. Speaking of a design problem, this is a really
Yeah.
strange way to do it. And I'm also trying to, how should I say this? I'm trying to keep it as tight and claustrophobic as possible. So rather
Mm.
than doing a mega world building project, I'm interested to see how much world building you can do with, say, only four characters in an apartment.
Wow. Oh, that's interesting. It's also interesting to kind of think of the design problem of how the tools shape the writing. How will that be different, that this is all in one document? How does that actually change how you write or what you write? Have you noticed any of that yet?
Yeah, it makes it's more terrifying because you lose things, right? Like you lose track, and it's also it's making me less precious. And I'm not a very precious writer. I'm a pretty heavily like redrafting writer, but this is really pushing me to a new level of not being attached to certain like turns of phrase even.
Mm. I think that's a really great way to wrap up. And so I want to ask you the last question that I end all of these, which I'm especially excited to ask you because you are such a wide reader. I'm just curious what you're reading right now.
Oh, good question. Well, I just read Becoming Insomniac: How Sleeplessness Alarmed Modernity. It's like
Sounds
that's
right. Makes sense.
it's such a good book. It's full of just incredible stuff. I don't think that's like for a wide readership, but it was definitely for me. And let's see, I just read all the Patrick Melrose novels by Edward St.
Oh, yeah. I love
incredibly
those.
enjoyable, and just like you couldn't find a better teacher for dialogue.
Yeah.
It's bananas, his dialogue. I've never read anything like it.
I'm due for a reread of those. It's been a while since I read all of those back to back a couple years ago and just was obsessed for a while. I was telling everybody to read them.
Yes, it's hard. I mean, that's the kind of books you just want to literally start talking about immediately.
Yeah.
I will also plug this weird mid-century science fiction author, John Wyndham, whose books are being reissued by Modern Library right now. He wrote the classic Day of the Triffids, which has been made into movies a couple times, but he also just wrote some really, really bizarre kind of like alien invasion stuff that I'm just loving.
Oh, wow. Are you able to separate sort of reading for pleasure and reading for research, or is there a difference between those for you?
Nope. I read for pleasure all the time, and it's always also work.
Right. I love that. That is such a great. You did not let me down with your answer for what you were reading. I knew it would just be all over the place.
It is all over the place. There's no cohesion, but in my mind, this is like a perfectly orchestrated like set of reading materials.
And when I'm sure when we read the new novel, it will all make sense. We'll be like, oh, there's the alien invasions. That's how that came in.
Oh my God, completely. It's already worked its way in.
I love it. Elvia, I am such a big fan of how you think about things. I think, I don't know if you would call yourself a design writer, but I think you're just such a smart and thoughtful writer of design in the design world. And it was so nice to kind of hear how you think about all of this and even your process a little bit. So thanks for doing this. Thanks for being on the show.
It was a total joy talking to you. I really enjoyed stretching and talking about new things.
This episode was recorded on August 26th, 2022. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.